Hello, and welcome to the second episode from the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'll be discussing what it means to be radical, and I'll be explaining what we mean by a cultural genealogy of ideas. In the previous episode, I discussed the important issues underlining the framework of radical mass media criticism, including its 5 historical periods beginning in the mid-19th century. I ended the episode by saying that in the not-too-distant future, the task will be to add a 6th period that monitors media output in the age of the Internet. And, importantly, to begin to document the contemporary writers who could be considered as radical media critics to be included within the genealogy of radical mass media criticism. To recap, the book's full title, that John Theobald and I edited, is Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy. And there are 2 questions I'm often asked about the title. The first question is, what is the difference between radical mass media criticism and mass media criticism? The second question I'm asked is, what do you mean by a cultural genealogy? So firstly, by adding the word radical, we sought to go beyond what I call mere criticism in Chapter 1. The second point is that we were aware that it may appear there's no real substantive difference between mass media and media, because by definition the media is mass-produced. So why add the word mass to the title? For us, the inclusion of mass media in the title is, on one level, a simple tautological device to gain full attention to the fact that its creation in the mid-19th century began reaching wider audiences, particularly with the invention of the telegraph. Today, both time and space have been vastly reduced due to the speed and transmission of news and information that now reaches a mass so large it's sometimes difficult to comprehend. Large media corporations have historically dominated the airways for well over a century, but now the Internet allows citizens to become news producers, entertainers, and much more. But Internet production by citizens not aligned to media corporations does not require the removal of the word mass, because the technological networks where production takes place reaches audiences on a huge scale. This is mass consumption thrown into the stratosphere. It is a mistake, in my view, to argue that because a citizen not associated with traditional newspaper formats, who now writes alone, is somehow different in form to the way journalists have traditionally worked. After all, it was and remains the case that an individual journalist writes copy and the copy is published and then widely distributed. The same process applies to the individual citizen journalist, and the copy she or he writes is widely published as a journalist working for the BBC or any other large corporation. That said, one question to pose for now is this: is corporate control of media production less effective over people's thinking in the age of the Internet and social media? I recall the Argentinian anthropologist Nestor Garcia Canclini once said, and I quote, "Consumption is good for thinking." I recall a friend of mine being puzzled by this statement, and it does sound strange. But after reading Canclini, it became clear to me why he said it, and it is mainly to do with a rejection of the Frankfurt School's approach to mass media research and media effects on thinking. For some of the Frankfurt School writers, they were known to have had a negative view of what they considered mass-produced information, which for them resulted in the dumbing down of culture. can cleanly thought the opposite, but I have to say the truth probably lies somewhere in between these two viewpoints. Suffice to say that I will be discussing these issues in more detail in later episodes. So, for the moment, and with regards to radical mass media criticism, allow me to read a passage from Chapter 8, written by Sander Miller on page 125. And I quote, "This book draws a sharp distinction between accepting mass media, whether consciously or otherwise, as a hegemonic instrument of power, and the radical critique which rejects this domination. It also describes itself as a genealogy, generally defined as the study of family descents, but which here specifically incorporates Michel Foucault's use of the term, relating it to the elaboration of a narrative of radical criticism and the institution of historiography. Furthermore, it presents itself as a history. We define history as the study of the origins and evolution, primarily of the world, but, thanks to Hegel, subsequently of anything at all. And why not mass media? Accordingly, radical mass media criticism, more than before, becomes a category of thought with its own history, which needs to be comprehensively unearthed if the hegemonic narrative is to be challenged." And she goes on to say, "The archaeological process undertaken here should elucidate a past from which an alternative, opposing story about the development of the mass media as a component of mass communication emerges more clearly and is shown to contribute to the broader historical process." Sander acknowledged the objectives of what John Theobald and I were attempting to do with respect to radical mass media criticism, which is clearly stated in that passage. After all, she says that radical mass media criticism is a category of thought with its own history, which needs to be comprehensively unearthed. In the first chapter of the book, titled "The Meaning of Radical and a Genealogy of Ideas," I set out to explain why we included the word radical. Quite often, a person who is viewed as a radical is often seen to be of an extreme personality, someone who is a threat to established norms. I consider myself a radical. I even see it as a badge of honour, so why do so when it has so many negative connotations? Well, the short answer to that question is people who use radical as a form of abuse do so out of complete ignorance of its true meaning. Now, it's interesting to note that the original publisher of our book, who will remain nameless, suffice to say, is an established publisher, asked John and I to remove the word radical from the title. They claimed that having the word radical in the title might be contentious in the USA in the aftermath of the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. The attack was presented in news reports by extremists connected to Al-Qaeda. To say we were shocked to hear the publisher associate radical with extremism was an understatement. Of course, we refused to remove it, and after going through a similar experience with another established publishing house, we finally published it with a small publishing house called Black Rose Press in Canada, which is why it took so long to get it published. In recent times, the term radicalization, the process of becoming a radical, has been applied towards Islamic fundamentalists who were and still are seen as a threat to so-called Western values. Interestingly, such words are never directed towards evangelicals in the USA, who are paid-up supporters of Zionism in Israel, who in turn perpetrate war crimes and acts of genocide against Palestinians. Of course, evangelicals and Zionists are more likely to direct the word radical towards Islamic fundamentalists to categorize them as extremists. But Zionists also perform extreme actions as they terrorize Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Israeli Zionists routinely imprison Palestinians without charges. This is called administrative detention. It's not only cruel and barbaric, it is also extreme. The truth of the matter is this. The meaning of radical is a much misunderstood and often used as a form of abuse, directed against people or groups seemingly on the margins of society. But there are countless examples where respectable or so-called respectable mainstream politicians have been labelled radical in a positive sense of the word. Let me provide an example. In 1989, Chris Painter wrote an academic paper titled Thatcherite Radicalism and Institutional Conservatism. And here is how Painter begins. The extent to which Mrs. Thatcher's arrival in Downing Street acted as a political catalyst for institutional reform initiatives and changes in Whitehall warrants close attention. Has the radical impetus of the new conservatism permeated the Whitehall system and promoted anything remotely resembling genuine, lasting reforms? Painter continues by stating, Maurice Weil recently observed, it is a remarkable fact that when the present government, which sees itself as so radical, has completed its third term of office, there will be no significant difference from the system of government that existed in 1979, except it will have fashioned a more centralized state. By the way, both references to radical in those passages are written in uppercase to emphasize the point to the reader. Thatcher died in April 2013, and the Guardian newspaper produced a piece soon after titled April 1979, Thatcher outlines her radical ideology. And within that piece was an article written by its political editor, Ian Aiken, in 1979. In the first paragraph, Aiken refers to a speech in Cardiff that year when Thatcher identified herself with the prophets of the Old Testament, describing herself as a conviction politician. As the Guardian's 2013 piece states, the speech by Thatcher was referred to as "This is my faith speech." In the 1979 piece by Aiken, he wrote, groping for every available sign of radicalism, she did not even jibe at Oliver Cromwell. Change was what she was after. Now, Reuters also published a piece soon after the death of Thatcher titled Thatcherism, the Radical Ideology That Became the Global Norm. So here's my question. Do the terms radical and radicalism, used in these examples, relate to extremity? Now, Thatcher and her supporters would certainly have seen their political ideology as common sense, ironically itself an ideology. And they argued that the pursuit of individualism was in our human nature. Now, it's worth mentioning that what constitutes human nature is contested between various philosophical perspectives. But to return to radical and its noun radicalization, here is how the National Society for the Protection Against Cruelty to Children in the UK define radicalism. They say radicalization is the process through which a person comes to support or be involved in extremist ideologies. It is, in itself, a form of harm. Using this definition in the context of what became known as Thatcherism would therefore put such an ideology on the very extreme of ideas. But the NSPCC's definition, taking its lead from the Home Office in 2011, is wrong. On the present British government website, it states, "Get help for radicalisation concerns." There are warnings about radicalisation everywhere, including the Oxfordshire Safeguarding Children Partnership, who state, under the heading Radicalisation, that the government has defined extremism as vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. We also include in our definition of extremism calls for the death of members of our armed services. Now, the Oxford Dictionary provides an example how radicalisation can be used in context by stating the radicalisation of the intelligentsia led to the revolution. But this could be applied to the American Revolution in 1765, which was an ideological and political movement, and equally it could be applied to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917. But because the outcomes of each were different, it doesn't make one or the other more or less radical than the other, if you see what I mean. So now we have some idea of the controversies and false statements, I would say, regarding the word radical. Let me read a passage from page 2 of chapter 1 under the subheading on the meaning of radical. Raymond Williams once claimed that the word culture was the second most difficult word in the English language. More recently, Terry Eagleton argued that culture was either the second or third most difficult, with nature being the first. Perhaps the third or fourth most difficult is radical. Perhaps not, for this is not a competition. Suffice to say that radical is indeed a complex word to define, and this is despite its stereotypical image, which is more often than not to associate radical or its cognate radicalism as a form of extreme, not of the norm, even perhaps subcultural or countercultural, in that it challenges the way in which we live, but challenges not so much in the ordinary, dare I say it, acceptable sense, but rather through the use of extraordinary methods. This is the popular perception of radicalism. Now, on page 1, I refer to a quotation by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx said this: "To be radical is to grasp something at its roots. But for man, the root is man himself." Now, what did Marx mean by referencing the word root? Let me read you a passage from page 6. Button, 1995, reminds us appositely that the word radical derives from the Latin word radix, which translates as root, and goes on to offer a working definition of what being a radical implies, which is going to the roots of an issue, examining it thoroughly, questioning everything, and leaving no stone unturned in the quest for respect and justice. Anthony Giddens, 1994, also states that radicalism means taking things by the roots. Described this way, radical activity is positively interpreted as a perfectly normal engagement, and not taken in the habitual pejorative sense of the word at all. What is more, this definition places radicalism as merely as a product of the Enlightenment in which humans could justify their opposition and dissent to authority. Now, in chapter 1, I also reference the writer Leopold Kohr's paper, The New Radicalism, which was published in 1967, where Kohr sets out to define what it means to be a radical. The contents of my narrative The context of my narrative, rather, is to acknowledge that one central objective of radicals is that they seek change. So allow me to elaborate this point by reading a passage from page 4. For the moment, it is reasonable to suggest that change is an important element of the meaning of radical. What sort of change and how you get it are two different things. It's not true that radical is the property of one particular ideology or philosophy. For instance, followers of the liberal thinker Jeremy Bentham were referred to as philosophical radicals, which included in the 19th century writers such as John Stuart Mill. In a similar vein, the Fabian Society in the early 20th century were regarded as radicals, and so too were Marxists. The term radical, it seems, very much depends on both philosophical perspectives and the context in which critical intervention takes place to achieve objectives and outcomes. It is this issue of change that features so prominently in Leopold Kohl's paper entitled The New Radicalism, published in 1967, where he begins by highlighting the problems in defining radicalism, but unfortunately produces some of the old stereotypes associated with it. For instance, Kohl argues that radicalism is an ideology urging change, no real problems there, but it is also a definition that is marked by a particular psychology of the mind. He says that a radical is impatient and demanding rather than reflective. Now, there's a few stereotypes thrown in to that piece and reference to Leopold Kohl. Now, it's worth pointing out that radical mass media criticism seeks to go beyond mere critique in that it seeks radical change. In relation to the word radical, a writer who has always intrigued me is the former chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, Jonathan Sacks. Both philosopher and theologian, Sacks had a profound intellect. He produced a wonderfully small book in size in 2000 called Radical Then, Radical Now, on Being Jewish. I'm not Jewish, but I wholeheartedly recommend non-Jews read this wonderful book. Sacks took a seat in the House of Lords as a crossbencher. In other words, he wasn't associated with any political party. Now here's my question. Why was Sacks accepted into the House of Lords, the symbol of conservative establishment, when he wrote a book called Radical Then, Radical Now? Now, I'd like to read a passage from chapter 1, which is on page 8, and I quote, "Under the chapter headline Covenantal Society, Sacks explains that in Judaism there are unusually two political theories, one of the state and one concerning society. Both express simplicity and humanity, he says. But the theory of the state is merely a secondary concern. Far more fundamental, he says, is its theory of society and its insistence that the state exists to serve society and not vice versa. The logic underpinning the just society, which is the rationale that both creates and holds society together, is the social covenant, rather than the social contract that creates the state. One defining feature of the covenant is the notion of the tzedek that is based on radical principles such as social or distributive justice. Now, you can understand why Sacks was a crossbencher in the House of Lords with such a crossover of ideas that straddles both left and right. He embraced aspects of socialism in terms of the collectivity, but at the same time he embraced ideas from liberalism and capitalism in that it supported the notion of individuality. Now, finally, it is worth reading Anthony Giddens' book titled Beyond Left and Right, where, like Core, he argues that the meaning of radical is not to be aligned to any particular political philosophy. So now let me address the use of the term cultural genealogy in the title of the book and explain what we mean by a genealogy of ideas. Let me firstly state that, as Sandra Miller wrote in her introduction to her chapter on Amar Matalat, that both genealogy and history are placed together for understanding radical mass media criticism as a category of thought. In other words, a category of thought with its own historical precedents, which are contextualized as genealogical. Genealogy is the study of family descent, which is based on DNA. But our use of the word genealogy isn't a study of biological connections, but rather as a genealogy of ideas. This means that the genealogy of ideas has its own specific history, which is why we trace those beginnings to the emergence of mass media to the mid-19th century. It is a family of ideas, shared radical perspectives, against the way the mass media has developed under capitalist economics. And it is these shared radical perspectives that forms a DNA of thought. This isn't to be confused as a history of ideas because of the differences between them. Think Marx and John Locke, for example, one a communist, the other a liberal. So, who exactly influenced us, or to put it another way, who provided us with the theoretical framework for radical mass media criticism as a cultural genealogy? Allow me to read a passage from page 11 to explain this. It is at this point that I briefly introduce the work of both Nietzsche and Foucault concerning genealogy. These provide radical mass media criticism with a theoretical framework that calls on a network of ideas in relation to each. Particularly Nietzsche's book on the genealogy of morals and Foucault's paper, Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, will be drawn on. In reference to Judith Butler's work concerning Foucault's concept of genealogy, Colwell, 1997, acknowledges that genealogy requires outlining points that are common to each other. Those bloodlines that are intrinsically and systematically connected in a bounded commonality, and states that, at one theoretical level, genealogy traces the lines of descent that run between identity categories. Friedrich Nietzsche's book, titled On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, is both based on and expanded upon his previous work, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, produced 1 year earlier in 1886. In Foucault's paper titled Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, he assesses the relationship between Nietzsche's concept of genealogy with history in a traditional sense. Nietzsche's concept of genealogy includes two important terms. The first is called Herkunft, and the second is Entstehung. Let me explain Herkunft by reading a passage from page 12. And I'm directly quoting from Michel Foucault. Herkunft is the equivalent of stock or descent. It is the ancient affiliation to a group, sustained by the bonds of blood, tradition, or social class. The analysis of Herkunft often involves a consideration of race or social type, but the traits it attempts to identify are not the exclusive genetic characteristics of an individual or an idea. Rather, it seeks to the subtle singular and sub-individual marks that might possibly intersect in them to form a network that is difficult to unravel. And then I go on to say, it is this network of ideas that radical mass media criticism is attempting to unravel, to reveal the synthesis of thought, while simultaneously acknowledging different points of interaction that form the origin of thought. That is to say that, even if there is a coherent structure of thought that we can conceptualize as radical mass media criticism, it is only united in the acknowledgement of the various inflections that constitute its totality. As Foucault remarked, the genealogist sets out to study the beginning, numberless beginnings whose faint traces and hints of colour are readily seen by an historical eye. With reference to Entstehung, Foucault explains it designates emergence, the moment of arising. And Foucault also says emergence is always produced through a particular stage of forces. Now, allow me to explain what these 2 points of Entstehung mean for radical mass media criticism. Regards to designating an emergence, or the moment of arising, as Foucault said, we set this date of the rise of the mass media in the mid-19th century. With regards to Entstehung as an emergence as a product of a particular stage of forces, this means both the emergence of mass media in mid-19th century and the emergence of radical mass media criticism, beginning tentatively with Kierkegaard, but more emphatically with Karl Marx, Karl Bucher, Ferdinand Tönnies, and Karl Kraus. And this is what John meant when he explained that, and I quote, "Radical mass media criticism has a history that is temporally near identical to that of the mass media themselves. I categorize this as a moment of a dialectical conflict of ideas." In the next episode, I'll be exploring the writing of the Austrian satirist Karl Kraus and his place within the genealogy of radical mass media criticism. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.